Okay, a couple quick ones here. Again, normally we do this chapter in a different order. We would cover this one first, but I thought it'd be easier maybe if we covered it the opposite order this time around. The idea here is that we're going to be doing a little bit more in terms of how we actually wire the nervous system to the muscular system, to the skeletal muscles anyway. And so in order for us to do that, we need to think first about some basic circuits. And we've talked about some of these basic kinds of circuits before when we've talked about reflex arcs, and this is really all this is. And this is something that we had a chance to do in class, right? The old reflex, the patellar reflex specifically, wherein the stretch of this patellar tendon is somehow perceived and gets sent back to the central nervous system, where we have a pre-programmed response, which is of course to kick out. Now, what's actually happening here though is that as we take our little reflex hammer and as we stretch this tendon, what we're actually doing, the way we're actually measuring that is with a little structure inside the muscle itself called a spindle. And that spindle is a sensory structure, okay? It runs back to our central nervous system, right, through the dorsal root, right? Of course, that's our sensory part of the spinal cord. We have a pre-programmed response, a little interneuron activity here, and two things actually happen. One thing, the obvious thing, right, is we have an excitatory action here that causes the extensors, right, the muscle that was triggered, to contract, right, which causes your leg to flip out. But what we probably don't think about, but is equally important, is that we also have to inhibit the flexion of the muscle behind it. The way that our muscles are arranged, our skeletal muscles are arranged anyway, are in these antagonistic pairs, okay? So in this particular case, we have one muscle that's involved in extension of the joint and one muscle that's involved in contraction of the joint, right? So for this reaction to happen, we have to stimulate the agonist here, right, and relax the antagonist. Simple as that. So this is a pretty simple mechanism, but there's a lot, really a lot going on there. So let's take a closer look here first at what's happening inside that spindle. So the spindle itself is a structure buried within the skeletal muscle. It's between the fibers within a individual fascicle. It's actually made up of muscle fibers, but they're a special kind of muscle fiber called intrafusal muscle fiber. And these guys are wired to two different neurons, okay? So the normal muscles, right, the ones we talked about in the last chapter, right, these extrafusal ones, because they're outside the spindle, they're connected to motor neurons. We're going to call these alpha motor neurons, okay? These are afferent. They're the ones that bring in contraction activity. They're the first part of that contraction excitation coupling process, right? Within the muscle spindle, we also have motor neurons, but these are gamma motor neurons, okay? And these are there simply to keep the spindle under mild tension, okay? And the reason that's important is because what's going to happen is if these guys aren't under mild tension, when we stretch them, we have no baseline to measure against, right? So they have to be constantly slightly taut just so that we can have some baseline. In the middle here in blue, right, we have these 1A sensory neurons, right? And these are what's going to measure the stretch. Okay, so these guys here, this whole deal here, right, this is a mechanoreceptor. Okay, so let's see what's happening here. Right, so we've got our normal extrafusal muscle fiber. Here's our intrafusal within the spindle. That 1A sensory neuron enters the capsule, binds to the intrafusal muscle fiber within it. Okay, when we stretch the muscle, right? So nothing, 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 stretch. Back to relax. When we stretch it, we get signals sent back to the central nervous system from this 1A sensory neuron, right? And the way that this is going to work, it's very much like the hair cells in some of our special sensory structures that we've talked about. It's always on, right? When you're at rest, it's constantly sending back signals on a regular pattern. And depending on whether we stretch it or we relax it, we'll send back signals at different speeds. So as we stretch, we go from to, and as we contract the muscle and as we shorten those intrafusal fibers beyond their normal resting length, or under their normal resting length, maybe is a better way to put it, those signals go from to, and they can actually get so distant that they're essentially stopped, right? So again, we're just sending back information to the nervous system about how every muscle in your body, or skeletal muscle in your body, is contracted or relaxed, and the degree to which they're contracted or the degree to which they're relaxed. This is going to tie into something kind of fun. This is called the crossed extensor reflex. So just like we saw here, right at the very beginning, when we contract, all right, not only do we contract the agonist muscle in the reflex, but we also have to relax its antagonist, right? And so in this particular example of our crossed extension reflex, we're going to step on a Lego, right? True to my experience anyway, or a tack or something, right? And when we do that, right, we're going to want to pull our leg up or pull our foot up and away from it, right? So here, our agonist-antagonist relationship is reversed, right? In this case, the flexor, the one that's going to bend your knee and pull your foot up and away, is the one that's stimulated. And the extensor, right, the one that you're using to put your leg down, okay, is inhibited. And so we pull your leg up and away, right? That's great. Here's the problem. I want you to imagine that you are stepping forward. You've got your one foot off the ground, your other foot bearing all your weight. That foot you're bearing all your weight on is the one that stepped on something, and you immediately try to pull it up and away. It's going to happen. You'll fall on your ass, right? So the crossed extension reflex, okay, not only works with this leg, but it also crosses the spinal cord, okay, and has the opposite effect on the opposite leg. So as you put your foot down, step on something, right? So your feet are like this, right? Pick your foot up, put your foot down, step on something. This foot comes up, this foot goes down, right? So that you can not fall on your ass. It's kind of a beautiful little thing that goes with that. And I have no idea if this is going to work, but I have a little video, student video, not one of my students, but one that's up on YouTube that demonstrates a little part of this.
Hello, America, and welcome to Science News Today with Danielle Price. Wait, breaking news. Someone just stepped on a tack. Let's go see what happened at the scene. As you can see in the video, when Brittany stepped on the tack, she withdrew that leg and put all of her weight on the opposite limb. This is known as the cross-extensor reflex, which...
So I don't need to show you the whole thing because, frankly, we're already on YouTube. But that's just what that's about. Okay. Now, we've, up to this point, right, kind of had a very simplistic view of how all this works. In reality, these reflex arcs are really substantially complicated. We've got motor signals coming down from the central nervous system. We've got sensory information coming back and mediating the reflex coming back up. We end up with what's called alpha-gamma coactivation. We have stimulation and inhibition of these 1A fibers, all of which, right, is here in this diagram, and there's all this other stuff. The take-home message, really, from this diagram, from this complication here, is that sensory information coming back to the spinal cord is there primarily to mediate the motor response. Okay, so the information from the spindle is mostly used to correct or modulate rather than stimulate. So outside of a few reflexes, few isolated reflexes, those spindles are really there to kind of have a correcting action on your contractions. So let's see what that actually means. This is the last thing we'll cover in this little video. Okay, so you've decided I'm done. I'm gonna go work at, I don't know, you say, I used to say go work at Haas's, but of course Haas's is closed, so I can't say that anymore. But pretend that they're not closed and pretend that's where you want to go work. You're going to go and you're going to pick up an application, right? The application form is not thick, right? It's a buffet restaurant. There's no security clearances or anything, right? So it's like a one sheet. You go and you're going to decide that there's a little bit of weight there, and you're going to have a certain amount of energy, right? A certain amount of tension you're going to apply, right? This is where recruitment and wave summation, all that stuff we talked about in the last series of videos comes into play. You're going to apply a predicted amount of tension in order to lift the application. Okay, you're going to estimate and you're going to apply. Your spindles are there to tell you whether or not it's actually sufficient, right? Have you met your goal? Are you going way beyond your goal, right? Whatever it is, if you're not right at the amount of tension you need to apply to lift that job application, it's going to allow you to correct it, right? This is where the co-activation part comes in, right? We are stimulating not just the extrafusal muscles during contraction, but also those gamma ones. We're applying some amount of tension to the spindle, okay? And that amount of tension and the ultimate response to that tension, right, gets translated back into sensory information, which comes back to the alpha neuron and informs the action of the muscle itself. Okay, so here, no load, no activity, everybody's good. Let's just say, however, that you also accidentally grabbed a brick and you didn't realize it. The amount of tension you brought to bear to lift the paper is not enough to lift both the paper and the brick. And so here instead, that intrafusal, that spindle, is going to be stretched, right? And it's going to send an error signal, right, back to those alpha motor neurons. And you're going to be able to correct, right? You're going to increase the amount of tension through recruitment, through wave summation, whatever, in order to lift both the brick and the job application. Okay, so from there, we're going to move forward and talk about some other minor aspects of control here, nothing too wild and crazy, but that's for the next video.